So welcome everyone. Thank you so much for coming to this special event. My name is Hwan-Soo Kim, and I teach Korean religion and culture in the Department of Religious Studies. I also serve as chair of the Council on East Asian Studies. It is my tremendous honor to host this event for two prominent scholars of East Asian history, politics, and culture. The central theme of today's conversation is, what is Korea? Of course, Korea has not existed in isolation, and thus the more specific question is, how has Korea preserved its political and cultural identity throughout the 5,000 years of its tumultuous history? An identity that it has shared, negotiated, and contested with those of its neighboring countries, China and Japan, and beyond. Professor Myung-chul Yoon will give two talks, one today and the other this Friday, to shed some light on this subject. And to make our conversations more relevant to modern and contemporary international relations, Professor Arne Westad from the Department of History here at Yale is kindly joining us to share reflections from his most and highly acclaimed book called Empire and Righteous Nation, 600 Years of China and Korea Relations, which is also translated into Korean. So these three talks combined, luckily for us, will span the entire 5,000 years of Korean history and enlighten us on the distinctive and common characteristics of Korean identity in the regional and global context. These talks will also illuminate the precarious conditions on the Korean Peninsula in the face of a Beijing-centric order and the increasing assertiveness of Korea with its international influence. So today's event will be divided into two parts. Professor Westad will first speak for 30 minutes about his book, followed by Professor Yoon. Professor Yoon's presentation will be translated by my dear colleague, Professor Jun An from the University of Michigan. Thank you so much. He's a professor of Korean studies, so he's joining us especially for this purpose. After the two presentations, our speakers will have the opportunity to ask questions of each other, and we will then open the floor for your questions from the audience. In the interest of time, and due to the video recording of today's event, I would ask that you write your questions on the note cards being distributed, and I'll be reading later on after collecting them. Let me briefly introduce our two speakers. Dr. Myung chul Youn is a professor emeritus of history at Dongguk University and is currently professor of archeology at Samarkand State University of Uzbekistan. His research focuses on the history of the Goguryeo period from the 1st century BC to the 8th century CE, as well as East Asian maritime history. He's published over 60 books and numerous journal articles. He's also a poet and explorer and has published 14 books of poetry. Professor Arne Westad is a scholar of modern international and global history with a specialization in the history of Eastern Asia from the 18th century on. He studied at the University of Oslo before receiving his graduate degree at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. Professor Westad has published 16 books, many articles, and received numerous awards. He taught at the London School of Economics and Harvard History. And you joined Yale 3 years ago?
2019.
Yeah, and Yale snatched him from Harvard. Today's event is supported by Hongnam Kim's Korean Studies Fund, and special thanks go to the council staff, Kathy, and particularly In-jung Kim, without whose logistic help, I would be deeply exhausted and sick in bed. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Arne Westad.
So thank you very much, Wansu, for that wonderful introduction. It's a great honor for me today to speak together with Professor Yoon. I want to hear what he has to say, so I will be relatively brief in presenting my book. And for those of you who are at Yale, you know where to find me, so you can easily seek me out and discuss these things with me. So this is a book that came out of a set of lectures, so-called Reuchower lectures, that I did at Harvard in 2017. And the idea is to try to look at the relationship between China and Korea over a long period of time. Right? And in order to get to some of the essential aspects of that relationship. It has been an ever-changing relationship, as you'll hear me talk about in a minute. But there are some structural aspects of it that seem to me to connect at least the period when I start up, at the beginning of the Ming and the Joseon states, to what has come later. So it is not without relevance when we try to understand today's relationship between a new Chinese state, calls itself the People's Republic of China, and the two Korean states. So history matters, but not always in the manner that we assume. There is no automaticity in this, but people learn from their history. At least they try to learn from their history, because there isn't all that much more that you can learn from, particularly when you're dealing with neighbors, and in Korea's case, very powerful neighbors to the north and the west and the east as well. You have to learn, and Korea has learned through that long process. The empires learn as well. Now they learn differently. They learn in a different form. So this is where the title of the book comes from: Empire and Righteous Nation. And Professor Yoon has the recently published Korean edition, to which I wrote a new preface. So by talking about empire, it wouldn't be that difficult to understand who I have in mind when I speak about empire. I speak about China in its various forms. So we're dealing with several different incarnations of these states, going back to the early Ming era. I'm going to talk a little bit about empire in a minute in more general terms, but it's pretty clear what the title refers to, at least, in terms of empire. Now, righteous and nation are more complicated concepts. And I spend quite a bit of time at the beginning of this book to talk about those concepts. Now, by referring to Korea, again, no surprise, it's Korea I'm referring to when I use the expression righteous nation. As righteous, I don't, of course, mean that every Korean is righteous. Far from it. That is not based on historical evidence. I like Koreans, but not that much, that I would call all of them righteous. It would also be unfair. Too much to live up to. What I mean is that concepts of righteousness, yi in Chinese, we in Korean, is something that has played a particular role in Korean history going far back. It is an integral part of the Neo-Confucian Revolution that the early Joseon state signaled and symbolized. And it also became a key aspect, both of trying to understand how Korean society should work, but perhaps more importantly over time, at critical junctures in Korean history, as you will know better than me, as a resistance to foreign domination. So righteousness in this context, of course, has many meanings. But part of it is an appeal to a Korean understanding of the fundamentals of what it means to be Korean, the essence of the discussion that we are going to have today, which of course has varied enormously over time. Right? It is not in any way static. But this concept seems to me to come up again and again in various forms. Now, the concept nation is, of course, also, if you go back to the late 14th century, problematic with regard to Korea. And I'd like us to spend some time, if we have, afterwards, maybe discussing that. As I was writing this book, And I actually wrote most of the book in Beijing when I was visiting there at Peking University. I started thinking very seriously about the use of the concept nation, which of course is a 19th century European invention, right? In order to try to understand Korean history in an earlier time period. If you use this concept within a framework of automaticity, of course it becomes entirely anachronistic. But if you, as Professor Habush and others have done, go to the core of the European Romantic concept of nation in terms of how it is defined, then I think it's very hard to avoid the thought that Korea very distinctly in an Eastern Asian context have some of those characteristics already coming out of the beginning or being formed during the beginning of the time period that I'm talking about. And particularly during the Great East Asian War in the late 16th century, as has been noted by many historians that I build on, not least Korean historians. Some of those characteristics of what it meant to be, in a professed, proud way, a nation in Europe in the 19th century also seem to be rather strikingly similar to some, not all, of the concepts that Korean identity builds on during that time. So that's why it's called Empire and Righteous Nation. That's a long explanation for a title, but it is one that really brings you, I think, to the core of what I want to discuss in this book, about what stays relatively intact and what changes over time. So the book has three parts to it. My students, when I was writing it, like to joke that the first part deals with about 500 years of Sino-Korean relations, and the second part deals with maybe 70, 80 years of Sino-Korean relations, and the third part deals with the last 3 weeks of Sino-Korean relations. It's not quite as bad as that, but the first part is very much about the relationship between two empires based in China, the Ming and the Qing, and the Joseon state that both of them had to interact with, going up to the late 19th century. The second part, which I call the internationalization of East Asia, China, Korea, and the world, goes from the 1860s, 1870s up to 1992. And then the third one deals with the period much more recently, and particularly the future of Sino-Korean relations in the 21st century. So that is how the book is constructed. Let me talk just very briefly about each of these three parts before I pass the floor over to Professor Yoon. And then perhaps you can talk about some of this afterwards. So I said that both the Ming and Joseon were created in a very similar time period at the end of the 14th century, very much under the influence of the same kinds of ideas about state and the construction of society, the reconstruction of society at the end of the 14th century. In both cases, as historians have shown, you could talk about a Neo-Confucian revolution. It's particularly striking in the Joseon project because of the way the regime, in spite of its own vicissitudes and difficulties with getting established, as many of you will know about, insisted on the Neo-Confucian framework as being the foundation of the state in a very direct, rather concrete way. The Ming, which, by the way, as many of you know, had the same problems with getting the empire, the dynasty, established, also used forms of Neo-Confucian thinking in order to establish that state. I don't have time to go into the differences between the two, there were significant differences, but there were also significant similarities. And one of the trends that I follow then for the 15th and the 16th century especially is how various ideas and concepts on the Korean and on the Chinese side mutually strengthen, reinforce each other during a long-term conversation among Neo-Confucian scholars that go on during those 2 centuries, or at least up to the middle part of the 16th century. I find that hugely interesting because it is one of those cases where you find that there is a culture, and it's right to call this a culture, I think, even though it's more limited than many other forms of culture that we know, where you have people from very different backgrounds speaking different languages, but of course expressing themselves in written form in similar terms, exchanging ideas about how you can build a just and righteous state. And also crucially about how the relationship between the two should work. And that is where the issue that I deal with more than anything else in the first chapter really comes to. Because it is one thing to proclaim Confucian righteousness. It's another thing to try to implement this in the relationship between states. And that's, of course, something that the Sino-Korean relationship has always had trouble with defining. So what I find is that in spite of this flourishing world of exchange of ideas, and for that matter also of goods, that existed between China and Korea, the Joseon insistence on being linked but outside the empire is perhaps the core value that regulates the relationship between the two. And this is important because the Ming in other forms, as many of you will know, and of course the Qing even more that followed it, were expansionist states. Right? It wasn't given from the beginning, particularly with this definition of a common culture, that the Joseon state would necessarily stay outside of these expanding empires, and particularly true for the Qing. So in addition to the principles that both of them based themselves on, there also had to be a lot of practical thinking about how this relationship should actually work and how it should be expressed. Because within the Neo-Confucian framework, again, as many of you will know, how you express things is of incredible significance in terms of how you should understand the reality that you live under in terms of concepts. So the question I asked towards the end of that chapter is how it was possible for a much weaker state, as Joseon definitely was, to keep its independence, and I here deliberately use the modern term independence, when confronted with an empire, with empires that were expansionist and inclusionist in many ways. And my answer to that question is manifold. One, which I think is truly important, is through the principle of always knowing more about the empire than the empire knows about you. That could be a fancy name for intelligence, and it is to some extent, though it goes much wider than intelligence. So the tribute missions that took place to China, to the Ming, and then to the Qing afterwards, were also fantastic opportunities for gathering information about the empire and the empire's intentions. And I would go as far as saying that if it weren't for that, then Joseon would have been much more exposed with regard to China than what was the case in reality, particularly during the transition from Ming to Qing, which, and I don't have time to go into that today, but was of course highly problematic from a Korean point of view. So knowing more about the empire than the empire knows about you is a very important part of all this. The other part is, of course, to show, as Joseon scholars and the Joseon state showed increasingly as you get into the 17th and the 18th century, that you can be better practitioners of Confucianism, of Neo-Confucianism, than what even the empire can be. This is a remarkable time period when we think about it in ideological terms, in the relationship between the Qing and the Joseon. How was it possible for the Joseon kings to get away after the big changeover and after having confronted and lost against the Qing armies in the early 17th century? Not just to keep its own independence, but keep on venerating long-dead Ming emperors, who of course were the sworn enemies of the Qing dynasty that was now encased in China, and get away with it. And the insistence that what Confucian scholars and the Confucian court, Joseon did in this context, was to practice righteousness with regard to the emperors that had gone before and that had had a relationship to Korea. I call it in the book a vassal relationship. It's hard to find an English term that actually works for this. Because the important thing for me is that Korea is linked to the empire but outside of it. So whatever way you want to express it. They were allowed to go on doing that because of that shared inheritance that even the Qing respected. And that level of even rather contrary Sinocentrism is, of course, then what gets into trouble increasingly towards the end of the 19th century when the Qing itself is receding. It's not that the Joseon elite are particularly fond of the Qing. They are not. But living in a world where the Chinese empire, a Chinese empire that Korea has so long been linked to in one form or another, offers both enormous challenges, maybe first and foremost in the relationship to Japan, but also enormous opportunities for rethinking what kind of state formation that a truly independent Korea should have. Now, that's what then defines the second chapter of the book. Because it is in many ways an enforced internationalization of East Asia that takes place during this period. Enforced first and foremost because of Japanese aggression against Korea, and for that matter, against China as well. But also because other countries get into the mix in terms of defining the framework. It's so far removed from what you find in the early 19th century, never mind the 17th and the 18th century. My verdict in the book is that in spite of being occupied, of being colonized, losing its independence to Japan, Korea, and being, suffering the consequences of that, almost immediately in Korea, you have this transition over to new forms of thinking about nation and nationalism coming out of the late 19th century. One could almost go as far as saying that part of the tragedy of Korea in the 20th century was that just as these new concepts of what Korea consisted of came of age, the country was occupied by Japan. So these forms of nationalism all had to grow up in exile. And we know what happens to nationalisms that grow up in exile. They get hypercharged, and they get absolutely convinced that the only version of a future for a country is the version that their particular brand of concept of nation or nationalism consists of. So by saying that, I'm not saying the same thing as some historians have been saying, including some American historians, that the origins of the division of Korea should be sought in those early divergences of Korean nationalism. I don't think that is enough of itself as a causal effect. I mean, the division of Korea came out of the Second World War and the Cold War and the division of the two occupation zones, without any doubt. But what it did was that it fueled the concepts of nation and national aims that then took root both in the South and in the North. It shaped and formed them in ways that are really, really significant. So that is leads up then to the third and final part of the book, where I talk about the relations between China and the two Korean states today. I'm not going to go into that too deeply here. You can read the book. Now, also in Korean, for those who prefer that. But I'm basically saying that much of the current Chinese policy towards the two Korean states is based on some of those principles and ideas that come out of the past, but in a new kind of format. And that new kind of format is definitely based on China's own rise, the PRC's own rise as an economic power over the past generation. Some ideas in that rise have come from Korea, just as some ideas about the organization of Confucian society in the Ming in the 16th century came from Korea. But there are also an increasing, and to me worrisome level within the PRC of developing a form of Chinese nationalism that projects to Korea, to both Koreas and to other countries in the region, a new form of Sinocentrism that go beyond what you saw even during the Ming and probably also the Qing Empire. It is a form of putting China at the center that asks not for linkages and that form of intellectual, cultural inclusion, even under pressure, as happened in the case of the Qing, but in diplomatic and strategic terms, and will punish countries at the borders that do not profess to the same understanding of that centrality, that central role of China, as the current PRC leaders profess to. That worries me. It doesn't, not because of the way some of our American colleagues are saying, oh, this is bringing China back to the way it was during the great dynasties. It's not doing that. It is presenting us with a completely new kind of problem in terms of how China's fantastic rise, an admirable rise, will influence the smaller countries that surround it. Whether that will be a cooperative form or an authoritarian and forced form of cooperation between China and these countries. So that's where I leave it in terms of the book. It's a very brief book, so you might be able to read it in a couple of afternoons if you have an interest in it. I don't write many brief books, so if you want to read a brief book of mine, this might be a good place to start. So that is what I had to say. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, now Professor Yoon. Sorry.
Yes, sir. Thank you. How are you all? My name is Myung-chul Yoon. Yes, okay. I'm a professor and a poet, and sometimes I say I'm a explorer. Sometimes, okay. And my main study is ancient Korean history, and especially specialized Goguryeo. Goguryeo kingdom is very important in Korean histories and everything, and especially maritime history of East Asia. This is my main study. My book.
목소리를 좀 높여가지고.
Okay, I'm sorry.
번호.
It's okay. 이거 쓸까?
그건 마이크가.
The books written me. Today is very important to me, to Koreans, to Americans, and the world. This is a reason. It is my idea. Yes. 많은 사람들이 한국에 대한 관심을 갖고 있습니다. 특히 동아시아, 한국에 대한 관심이 매우 많아지고 있습니다.
Right now, a lot of people are interested in East Asia, especially Korea's place within East Asia.
그런데 많은 사람들이 한국의 역사 문화에 대해서 오해를 하고 있습니다.
But a lot of people have misperceptions and misconceptions about East Asia and Korea.
첫 번째, 한국은 중국 문화의 아류이다.
First, there's this idea that Korea is an appendage or connected branch of Chinese history and thought.
그리고 한국의 역사는 코리안 페니슐라 한반도에서만 전개되었다.
There's also this idea that Korea's history and culture is limited to what happened in the Korean peninsula.
Yes, okay. Yes. The Hermit Kingdom and the Land of Morning Calm. 이거는 주로 19세기 말에 서양 사람들이 한국을 표현한 내용입니다.
Those expressions, Hermit Kingdom and the Land of the Morning Calm, are expressions that appeared in the late 19th century and were often used by foreigners to refer to Korea.
그런데 그 이후에 많은 사람들이 한국을 고요한 아침의 나라라고 오해하고 있습니다.
And that stuck, and that's how people continue to refer to Korea.
그리고 우리 한국은 중국이나 일본에 의해서 억압받았다고 오해하고 있습니다.
And there is the misperception that Korea has continued to be a nation that was oppressed by either China or Japan.
그리고 고구려 그리고 발해는 중국 역사의 일부이다.
And these two kingdoms in the past, Goguryeo and Balhae, are often understood just simply as parts of Chinese history.
이런 주장은 최근에 중국 정부와 학자들에 의해서 시도되고 있습니다.
And these claims have been advanced by scholars in China recently.
그리고 우리 고대 한국은 일본의 지배를 받았다.
And there is the claim that has been advanced that ancient Korea was dominated by Japan.
나는 역사학자입니다. 역사학자이기 때문에 사실을 근거로 발표를 합니다. 이런 것들은 상당히 근거가 없는 주장이라고 저는 생각을 합니다.
I'm an historian, I work with facts, and I believe that these claims are not based on facts.
우리 한국의 역사를 살펴볼 필요가 있습니다. 이것은 유라시아 세계의 지도입니다.
We need to look at Korean history. So let's start with this map. This is a map of Eurasia.
제 이론에 따르면 6개의 횡단로가 있습니다.
In my view, there are 6 major paths of connections that connected Eurasia.
그런데 가장 중요한 것은 이렇게 스텝 로드, 그리고 실크 로드, 그리고 머린 로드가 우리 한국을 향해서 모이고 있었습니다.
The most important are the 3 that he just pointed out: the steppe road, the silk road, and the maritime trade route road on the bottom there.
이런 지리적 위치를 이해하는 것은 매우 중요합니다.
And it's very important to understand these geographic developments to understand Korea properly.
우리 한국 사람들은 한민족이라는 단어를 쓰고 있습니다.
Koreans use the word the Han people.
Han peoples, the nation. And 이것은 중국이나 일본이나 유럽에서 사용하는 네이션 개념과는 차이가 있습니다.
And this is very different from the way the word nation is used by other countries.
그 이유는 다음 시간에 제가 상세히 말씀드리겠습니다.
I'll explain what that means next time. Friday.
Okay, Friday. Yes, Friday. 그리고 BC 15세기경에 우리 한국민의 조상이 처음 시작됐습니다.
So the emergence, as it says there, the emergence of the nation's ancestor or the origins of the Korean ethnic group dates back to BC 15 to 12th century BCE.
우리 한국의 역사에서는 주민들의 전면적인 교체가 없었습니다.
There wasn't a complete radical displacement of the people in the Korean peninsula.
그럼에도 불구하고 여러 지역에서 문화가 들어왔습니다. 그러나 워낙 토착 문화가 강하기 때문에 결국 우리 문화화 됐습니다.
So a lot of cultures and people came in, but it blended with the existing local cultures and traditions because the local cultures and traditions were so strong.
그리고 이것은 굉장히 중요한데 우린 긴 역사상에서 2번 외국에 의해서 망한 적이 있습니다.
There were 2 occasions when Korea was conquered.
Destroy and collapse. Okay. 그러나 우리는 계속해서 우리 한민족은 한 번도 변한 적이 없습니다.
But that didn't result in the complete transformation of the Korean people.
이것은 중국이라든가 몽골 아니면 투르크, 유라시아 어느 지역과도 비교할 수 없는 특징입니다.
And this is a unique characteristic that makes it very different from the Mongols, Turks, and others.
Okay. And 그래서 한국 사람들은 생활 공동체이고 문화 공동체이고 역사적 공동체입니다.
So Professor Yoon calls Korea a living and a cultural and also a historical community.
이런 것들이 워낙 강하기 때문에 한국 사람들은 강한 자의식을 갖고 있습니다.
And because these are so strong, Koreans have this a strong sense of community.
한국 사람들은 어떻게 생성됐을까? 많은 사람들이 관심을 갖고 있습니다.
A lot of people are interested in the issue of how Koreans emerge or where Koreans emerge.
제 이론에 따르면 8개 플러스 알파의 방향을 통해서 지금 이 땅에 모여들었습니다.
Professor Yoon's theory is that 8 routes were used for people to migrate into the Korean peninsula.
가장 중요한 루트는 바이칼 레이크, and 스텝 로드 and 머린 로드 이 세 가지 길이 가장 중요합니다.
So the three routes that were mentioned earlier through the Baikal area and also through the Silk Road and the maritime route were the three most important routes through which people entered the peninsula.
시간이 없으니까 빨리 가겠습니다. 그리고 우리 한민족의 기원 그리스도는 세 가지로 나누는데 첫 번째 우리 한국은 의외로 북방 유목문화의 영향을 많이 받았습니다. 현재 몽골 and 알타이 초원.
So early Koreans were influenced very heavily by northern peoples, especially those who speak the Altaic language.
그러나 인도를 시작해서 동남아시아를 거쳐서 한반도로 들어오는 문화도 있었습니다.
But there was also a culture that was transmitted via India and Southeast Asia into Korea.
예, 그래서 가장 무난한, 가장 적합한 표현은 북방에서 내려온 문화를 기본으로 하고 그리고 동방에서 온 해양 남방 문화도 섞였다. 이것이 가장 퍼펙트.
So in Professor Yoon's view, the best way to understand the emergence of Korea is to understand as the foundation the entrance of people through the northern route, but also supplemented and grown through the entry of people through the maritime southern route.
이것은 한반도에서 기원한 것이라는 주장인데 현재 북한에서 주장하는 내용입니다.
The theory that the native people of Korea originated from the Korean peninsula, this is a theory that is popular in North Korea.
제가 새로운 이론을 전개하겠습니다.
I'll provide an alternative theory.
동아시아 문명을 저는 이렇게 세 개로 구분을 했습니다.
I divide East Asian civilizations into these three separate civilizations.
Chinese civilization, one, and the second, Northern civilization and the Eastern civilization. 세 가지로 구분했습니다.
He divides it into these three civilizations: Chinese, Northern, and Eastern.
그리고 이스턴 시빌리제이션에는 코리안 한반도, 일본 열도, 만추리아 그리고 심지어는 일부의 동토까지도 포함합니다.
So in the Eastern civilization, he includes the Japanese archipelago, Korea, and of course the lands of Manchuria as well.
네. 그리고 좀 더 좁혀보게 되면은 동아시아를 이렇게 그릴 수가 있습니다.
If in a more narrower sense, we can think about East Asia this way.
여러분들이 보셨겠지만 이 지역은 The East Asian Mediterranean Sea. 그래서 동아시아 지중해라는 역사 모델을 제가 만들었습니다.
Professor Yoon, to understand East Asia, created a new model and called it the East Asian Mediterranean Sea.
약 20년 전부터 유럽, 중국, 일본에서도 이 용어를 사용하고 있습니다.
And since 20 years ago, since he developed it, this theory has been in wide use in other parts of the world as well.
이것부터 여기까지는 이렇게 multinational, 다국간 지중해 형태를 띄우고 있습니다.
The Mediterranean Sea, as you can see here, connects various points on this map and connects various regions and countries today into one region.
그랬을 경우에 우리는 지정학적으로 한 가운데 있고 지경학적으로 허브에 있고 그리고 문화적으로 인터체인지에 있고 그리고 지오멘탈로지 이것은 제가 만든 용어입니다. 지오멘탈로지 입장에서는 허트에 있다. 그러니까 기존의 주장과는 다르고 한국은 이렇게 한반도만이 아니라 실제로서는 이런 동아지중해에서 매우 중요한 역할을 했다고 저는 주장해 왔습니다.
So his theory is different from previous theories in that he places Korea at the core of the geopolitics of the East Asian Mediterranean Sea. He puts Korea as the hub of the geoeconomics of the Mediterranean Sea. He also puts Korea in the interchange point of the geoculture of the East Asian Mediterranean Sea. And last but not least, an expression that he coined himself, he puts Korea at the heart of the geomentology of the East Asian Mediterranean Sea.
그러나 조선 시대는 아닙니다.
But this does not apply to the Joseon period.
이것이 바로 조선 시대에 만든 지도입니다.
This is a map that was created in the Joseon period.
그러나 우리 한국 사람들이 이런 형태의 산 것은 불과 1000년밖에 안 되고 그 이전에 훨씬 더 긴 기간 동안에 우리는 한반도와 만주 일대와 그리고 바다 그리고 일본 열대의 일부분을 역사 활동의 공간으로 삼았습니다.
So what you see here is a conception of Korea that is no more than 1,000 years old. And prior to that, the Korean conception of territory was much larger and it encompassed everything from areas up in Manchuria down to the Japanese islands.
네. 이건 일반적인 거니까 그대로 넘어가겠습니다. 이를테면 구석기, 신석기, 청동기, 철기 시대.
He's just going to skip the periodizations because it's well known.
고조선. 고조선은 영어로 올드 조선이지만 저는 프로토라는 말을 사용했는데 우리 한국 사람들이 지은 최초의 국가입니다.
So Gojoseon is the country or kingdom that Koreans consider to be the very first Korean kingdom to have ever existed. But Professor Yoon actually prefers to call it not Old Joseon, which is the literal translation of the word Gojoseon, but rather Proto Joseon.
Okay. 이거는 고조선에 관한 저의 책입니다.
This is my book on Proto Joseon.
Okay. And 고조선의 영토는 현재 만추리아, 요동반도에 있고요. 그다음에 중만주에 있고 그리고 한반도의 북부 지방을 차지한 나라였습니다.
Gojoseon's territory roughly coincides with what is today Liaodong Peninsula, the middle of Manchuria, and also middle to north regions of the Korean Peninsula.
그 증거들을 제가 얘기합니다. 첫 번째는 돌멘, 두 번째는 브론즈 스워드, 세 번째는 브론즈 미러스, 네 번째는 포터리. 이 네 가지를 가지고 증명하겠습니다.
I use these four things as evidence to claim that that was the territories of Proto-Joseon.
우리 한민족에는 고인돌이 굉장히 많이 있는데 총 4만 기 이상으로 보고되어 있습니다.
There are a lot of dolmens. These are huge stone structures that were constructed everywhere. Apparently, there's over 40,000 of these. I didn't know that. Currently in existence.
The blue color is dolmen and red color is dagger. 이것은 현재 중국 땅의 요동반도에 있는 고조선의 고인돌입니다.
This is a Gojoseon or Proto-Joseon dolmen that currently exists in southern Liaodong Peninsula.
이거 매우 큽니다. 이게 바로 접니다.
That's him.
바로 big.
So you can see how big it is.
오케이. 그리고 이것은 현재 평양, 북한의 수도인 평양 근처에 있는 고인돌들입니다.
This is a dolmen in Pyongyang, in North Korea today.
매우 많습니다.
There are a lot of these.
이것은 전라북도에 있습니다.
This is in North Jeolla province in South Korea today.
이것은 전라남도에 있습니다.
This is in South Jeolla province in
그런데
South Korea.
전라북도와 전라남도는 그 지역만 2만 기 이상이 있습니다.
In just that Jeolla region alone, there are over 20,000 dolmens.
이것은 경상북도에 있습니다.
This is in North Gyeongsang province, which is in the southeastern corner of the Korean peninsula.
그러나 평양 이북에 있는 고인돌과 그리고 현재 한반도 남부에 있는 고인돌은 형태가 다릅니다.
But the shape of the dolmens in the north and south of the Korean peninsula are different.
그것은 스타일의 차이지 본질의 차이는 아닙니다.
It's not a fundamental difference, but rather a difference in style.
이것은 고조선의 전형적인 칼입니다.
This is a typical sword from the Proto-Joseon period.
어떻습니까? 매우 아름답죠?
Pretty, isn't it?
Yes. 근데 색깔도 그렇고 그다음에 저는 여기서 의미, meaning과 그리고 로직, 숫자를 발견합니다. 1, 2, 3 이렇게 3등분 되어 있습니다.
So he finds a logic in this, and he believes that it can be divided into three parts.
이것은 살상용이 아니라 분명히 의례용입니다.
He believes that this wasn't actually meant to be used as a weapon, but rather as a ritual implement.
이 칼은 현재 요서지방 아시죠? 랴오동반에 섰죠. 요서지방 이것은 요동지방에서 발견된 겁니다.
So the image on the left is from Liaodong Peninsula, and the image on the right is from Liaoxi. So
Okay,
they're two opposite directions of the same area.
이것은 일본 열도에서 발견된 것입니다.
And this is an example of that blade that was found in Japan.
이것은 가장 아름답게 있는 그대로 실사한 것인데요. 이것을 그린 사람은 나의 와이프입니다.
So that's a drawing of the thing that you see on the right there. It was done by his wife.
우리는 부부가
Who's here?
합심해서 우리 역사를 해석합니다.
The husband and wife worked together to reconstruct Korea's past.
애국자죠.
Nationalists. Patriots, sorry, patriot. That's a better word, sorry.
그래서 이것은 청동 거울인데요. 중국의 청동 거울과 우리 한국의 청동 거울과 북방 유목민족들의 청동 거울은 스타일이 다르고 문양이 다릅니다. 아이콘이 다릅니다.
So these are bronze mirrors, and he believes that the bronze mirrors in China and the ones that you found in the northern steppes, and also the bronze mirrors found in the Korean peninsula, are all different in style.
다만 일본 열도에서는 AD 3세기경에 중국 동경들이 많이 들어오지만 한국에서 건너간 동경이 훨씬 많습니다.
So some bronze mirrors around the 3rd century of the Common Era can be from China, can be found in Japan, but there are a lot more that actually came from the Korean peninsula.
여러분 이 글자가 보이십니까?
Can you see the words?
여기에 선이 13,000개의 선들이 있고 여기에는 이 동심원이 100개가 됩니다.
동심원이.
예, 이 원형이 100개가 들어있어요. 이게 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8,
I think you said
100.
13,000 lines, and then it's
Yes. 그리고 이 선과 선 사이는 0.3mm입니다.
And the distance between the lines is what you see up there.
이것은 엄청난 테크놀로지를 입증합니다.
And he believes that this is evidence of incredible technology.
청동거울과 청동검을 만든다는 것은 그 당시 때 최고의 하이 테크놀로지입니다.
The ability or the capacity to create bronze mirrors and bronze swords means that they were at the top of the technological game.
제가 분명히 말씀드리면 중국의 청동거울과 우리 조선의 청동거울은 확실히 다릅니다.
He wants to once again re-emphasize the fact that bronze mirrors produced in China and the bronze mirrors produced in Korea are very different.
네, 제 설명을 듣고 나니까 이 지도에 대한 의미를 잘 아시겠죠?
Now that you've heard what I had to say, you can see the significance of what you see here on this map, right?
그러니까 국가 개념과는 달리 문화 개념으로 볼 때 확실한 것은 적어도 이 지역은 우리 한민족과 깊은 연관이 있다. 이거는 분명합니다.
So when we go beyond the narrow understanding of nation and we understand it culturally, you can see that Korea encompasses a territory that is much bigger than the way it's imagined today.
네, 시간이 없어 그냥 넘어가지만 고인돌도 이런 지역에서 이런 발견이 됩니다. 그러나 오늘은 간단히 넘어갑니다.
So in the interest of time, he's going to skip over the fact that there are dolmens that are found in other areas that are currently China today.
BC를 전후한 시기에 우리 민족에게는 고구려 백제 신라카야라는 고대 국가가 탄생합니다.
So around the turn of the millennium in Korea, what you see is the rise of three kingdoms: Goguryeo, Baekje, and Shilla.
오케이, 첫 번째 국가가 바로 고구려입니다.
The first is Goguryeo, which you see here.
첫 번째 출발한 것은 현재 중만주 지역과 압록강 중류 지역입니다.
The origins of this particular kingdom is believed to be the middle part of the Yalu River and also middle Manchuria.
그러니까 프로토 조선과 고구려는 발생한 곳 자체가 현재 한반도가 아니라 한반도 밖의 만주 일대라는 겁니다.
So we should take note of the fact that the origins of Proto-Joseon and also Goguryeo lie outside of the Korean Peninsula and what is today Manchuria.
건국자는 주몽이라고 부르는데 하늘의 자손이라고 스스로 주장을 했습니다.
The founder of the kingdom is named Jumong, and he considered himself or called himself the son of heaven.
그런데 이 헤이븐이라든가 스카이는 중국적 천이 아니라 오히려 북방유목 민족들의 천, 즉 탱그리와 유사한 개념입니다.
And he believes that the heaven here does not refer to the heaven used in the old Zhou texts or the Confucian classics, but rather to the heaven that is worshipped up by the northern steppe people, like the Mongols.
당연히 고구려 사람들은 조선을 계승했고요. 그리고 북방 초원유목 문화를 많이 이어받았습니다.
And so he believes that the Goguryeo folk inherited much from Proto-Joseon and also from the northern steppe people.
이것은 고구려를 세운 추모의 아버지 하늘신이라는 해모시인데요. 현재 평양에 가면은 시조의 무덤에 이런 그림을 현재 북한 사람들이 그려놓았습니다.
So this is a painting of the father of the founder of Goguryeo, and he's considered to be a god in heaven. This is a painting that's currently housed in North Korea today, near what they believe to be, or in the shrine where they believe to be his tomb.
이것은 제가 1983년도에 한국과 일본 사이에는 7,000년 정도부터 해양 교류가 있었다는 것을 증명하기 위해서 뗏목을 타고 항해할 때 사진입니다. 그런데 보면은 이런 해모수 이런 그림이 그려져 있습니다.
He used the name of that god for the raft that he took himself to go from an island in Korea all the way over to Japan, just to show you that the 7,000 years of maritime trade and exchange did indeed happen and could happen.
저는 중국의 절강성서 한국까지 뗏목을 타고 3번 건넜습니다.
He's crossed from Zhejiang in China over to Korea 3 times already.
예, 한 번은 17일 동안의 흑산도까지 왔고요. 또 마지막 항해는 중국, 그다음에 한반도, 제주도, 일본까지 43일간 탐험을 했습니다. 그러나 그중 열흘은 서울에 있었습니다. 뗏목을 수리하느라고.
처음이 13일이었어요. 13일이었나요?
처음에는 요거는
흑삼도까지.
17일.
So the travel from China to an island called Huksamdo was 17 days. And he also took a raft to travel all the way over to Japan as well, which took, I think he said 43 days, out of which 10 were actually he spent in Seoul.
제가 이렇게 몸은 약해 보여도 실질적으로 신체적으로 강합니다.
I look weak, but trust me, I'm not.
그리고 고구려의 영토인데 오해하지 마십시오. 혹시 중국 학생들이나 또는 일본 연구자들이 오해할 수 있는데 고구려 영토는 실질적으로 이게 영토고요. 이것은 간접 영역이라고 합니다. 제 이론이고요. 이쪽은 인플루언스 에리어, 그건 영향권입니다. 그러니까 이 하얀 부분은 이렇게 북방의 타이거 문화권, 초원유목 문화권, 중국도 마찬가지로 지배하지는 못하고 각각 영향을 끼쳤을 뿐입니다. 이거는 우리도 중국도 몽골도 확실히 알아야 되는 사실입니다.
So he wants to make sure that he makes it very clear that what you're actually seeing here is not necessarily a concept of territory, but rather area of influence. And this area of influence was real, and it reached, as you can see, far really up north into territories that are still subjects of controversy today, especially among scholars of China and Japan.
이런 것들은 당연히 중국 사료나 고고학적인 발굴을 통해서 입증이 된 거기 때문에 의심의 여지는 없습니다.
And he reconstructed this area of influence using archaeological and textual evidence. So he doesn't think that there's really any room for different interpretations.
중국은 400년 동안 이 고구려 전성기 때 중국은 400년 동안 분열 시대에 있었습니다. 그래서 중국의 주변에 있는 많은 종족들이 중국을 공격했습니다. 이것이 그 당시의 현실입니다.
So at the height of Goguryeo history, China was in disarray, fighting amongst each other, and kingdoms like Goguryeo and other northern tribes took advantage of this fact to increase their influence in that area.
지금 지루하니까 잠깐 재미있는 얘기 하나 하겠습니다.
I'll tell you a fun story.
지금 여기 유연이라는 나라는 몽골계가 세운 나라인데요. 이 나라가 서쪽으로 가서 지금 카프카스 산맥에 머무르고 일부는 현재 불가리아 그리고 이탈리아 반대 롬바르디아 평원까지 가서 나라를 지었습니다. 그 나라 이름은 아바르 한국입니다.
So the fun story is the folks that you see here, the Roran, I think, they traveled far out west and they reached all the way over to Italy, where they settled.
그때 고구려는 남북으로 분단된 중국을 상대로 해서 등거리 외교를 추진했고 그래서 정치력이 강해졌고 무역망이 활발했습니다.
Goguryeo was able to take advantage of the split of China into the northern way and the southern Song and engaged in long-distance trade.
그것을 실천한 사람이 광개토 태양이라고 알려져 있고
And the person who facilitated all this is known to be King Gwanggaeto, whose stele you see here.
기념비인데 6.39m가 됩니다. 그리고 1775자가 새겨져 있습니다.
The stele is 6.39 meters tall and it contains over 1,700 words.
제가 여러분들에게 하고 싶은 말은 이것이 비가 크다. 광개토 대왕이 영토를 넓혔다. 그것이 중요한 것이 아니라 그 시기에 고구려가 지향했던 세계관 그리고 동아시아 세계에서 구축한 평화 체제가 의미 있다고 생각하는 겁니다.
What he wants to emphasize is not necessarily the size or the ambitions of the king, but rather the place of Korea within the larger geopolitical system.
확실히 우리 한국 문화권은 주변 지역을 침략하는 성격이 별로 없고 늘 평화와 공존을 지향했습니다. 그런 증거들은 얼마든지 찾을 수 있습니다.
And what he wants to emphasize is that the place of Goguryeo in this larger geopolitical system was a peaceful one, and that's what they aspired, and that was their worldview at the time.
제가 이 광개토 비에 대한 논문을 쓸 때 이런 제목을 썼습니다. 광개토 비 and beauty and logic and meaning 이게 제목이에요.
So he wrote something about this stele, and the title contains those words that you just heard: beauty, logic, and so on.
그리고 광개토 대왕의 무덤인데요. 직경이 66m가 되는데 보세요.
That's the king's tomb.
예, 9층의 피라미드입니다.
And it's a pyramid.
이런 모양으로 되어 있습니다.
And this is what that pyramid looks like.
이런 무덤이 현재 중국에 있는 만주에만 12개가 있는데 현재 남아있는 것은 이거 하나밖에 없습니다.
Tombs like this, there are over 12 in Manchuria, but the only one that currently remains is this one that you see here.
다음 시간에는 이 무덤이 가지고 있는 철학적 의미를 제가 설명하겠습니다.
On Friday, he'll delve deeper into the philosophical meanings of that too.
다음 시간에 꼭 또 오십시오.
So please come Friday.
그리고 고구려는 427년에 지금 현재 북한 땅으로 이천도했습니다.
So in year 427, Goguryeo moved its capital to what is today North Korea, to its new palace, the Anak Palace.
Palace and the castle.
And that's the castle from that period.
고구려의 무장력인데 AD 5세기에서 6세기 사이에 벽화 속에 있는 그림입니다.
This is from a mural from the 5th to 6th century CE.
당대 최고의 전투력을 자랑하는 무장력입니다.
And this is a depiction of a warrior of an army that boasted one of the most powerful armies at the time.
심지어는 투르크인들도 이거보다 한 100년쯤 늦게 암각화에 나올 정도입니다. 그러니까 고구려가 먼저이죠.
So this predates the Turkish depictions of the warriors by about 100 years.
다음 시간에 기능에 관해서 말씀드리겠습니다.
And on Friday, I'll talk about the function of these warriors.
다음에는 백제입니다.
Let's now talk about Baekje, the other kingdom.
시간이 없기 때문에 빨리 넘어가겠습니다. 예. 백제는 고구려에서 도망온 사람들이 세운 나라입니다.
Baekje was established by people who fled from Goguryeo.
그래서 초반에는 이렇게 고구려랑 싸움을 했지만 나중에는 신라랑 싸움을 했습니다.
And at the beginning, for that reason, they frequently had skirmishes with Goguryeo, but they later started to have wars with their neighbor in the south, Shilla.
AD 4세기부터 일본 열도로 진출했습니다.
And around 4th century CE, they began to expand their areas of influence to the Japanese archipelago.
이것은 백제 첫 번째 수도인데요. 여러분들 이 강이 바로 그 유명한 서울의 한강입니다.
So this is Baekje's first capital, and the river that you see there is the famous Han River, which splits the capital city
이것이
of Seoul.
팰러스의 성벽인데요. 바로 물가에 붙어 있다면 이것은 항구 도시인 것을 알 수 있습니다.
You can see the outlines of the original wall of the capital, and you can see that it's located right by the river, which means that this was a maritime kingdom.
한국 역사상의 많은 도시들은 대부분 항구 도시였습니다.
And
당연히 서울도 항구 도시입니다.
A lot of these ancient cities from this period are maritime cities, and they were designed to take advantage of maritime trade.
이것은 저의 이론입니다.
That's his theory.
이것은 올림픽이 열렸던 몽촌 토성인데 고구려인들이 사용했던 군사성입니다.
So this is a castle that was used by Goguryeo as their military fort.
그래서 서울 근처에는 이렇게 고구려와 비슷한 백제의 피라미드 무덤들이 많이 있습니다.
And that's why you see around the Han River Baekje period pyramids that look a lot like the pyramids from Goguryeo.
고구려는 이런 피라미드형 무덤이 현재 만주 지역에 무지하게 많습니다.
So there are a lot of these pyramids from the Goguryeo period in Manchuria.
나는 70번을 가봤습니다.
70번.
70번.
He went there 70 times.
Yes, okay. 백제 넘어갑니다. 그리고 신라가 있습니다. 가장 늦게 시작된 나라인데 파운더는 박혁허세 칸이라고 부릅니다.
The last kingdom to emerge is Shilla. The founder is known to be a man named Pak Hyok-gose.
칸. 칸 is 징기스 칸. 오케이. 주로 알타이어에서 왕, 나라에 쓰는 말이 바로 한 칸입니다.
The word Han in this context refers to the ruler or the nation.
징기스 칸, no. 징기스 칸 is correct. 징기스 칸. 칸 is 우리 코리안 한국 same. 또 알타이어에서 한은 똑같이. 그리고 제가 논문을 썼을 때 인류 역사상에는 39개의 카나테가 있었습니다. 카나테, 한국이 있었습니다. 한은 그만큼 알타이어에서 가장 중요한 단어입니다.
And that word Han comes from Altic languages and is shared among people who want to refer to the ruler, to refer to the ruler.
한강, 한글, 뭐 등등 전부 다 한이죠. 이것은 신라 전성기 때 올라온 거고 고구려는 이거 잘못됐습니다. 고구려는 이렇게 한 것이 아니라 이렇게 한 것이 이건 좀 과장됐습니다.
So the map of Goguryeo is a little off. It should be a bit lower at the top there. But what you're seeing here is Shilla at the height of its power.
한국 사람들은 고구려를 굉장히 크게 생각하고 싶어 하지만 전공자 입장에서 볼 때 고구려는 전성기 때는 물론 여기도 갑니다. 이렇게 해서 이렇게가 고구려가 직접 지배한 것이고 관리를 파견한 직접 지배고 나머지는 간접 또는 영향권입니다.
So Koreans tend to prefer to see Goguryeo as being much larger than it actually was, but the territories that Goguryeo dispatched officials and controlled indirectly was a much smaller area.
이것을 주목하십시오. 왜냐하면 5내기 6세기경에 신라는 북방에 있는 흉노 문화랑 매우 연관이 깊습니다.
He highlighted this fact in red here because he wants to emphasize the fact that around the 5th to the 6th century, there seemed to be culturally a connection between Shilla and the Seongno up north.
이것은 매우 복잡한 문제입니다.
This is a very complicated question.
이런 무덤들이 많이 있는데 이 무덤을 열면은 바로 흉노와 스키타이 문화의 유산들이 많이 나타납니다.
So these are tombs from Shilla. When you excavate them, what you find are remnants of cultural patterns that you can connect with the northern people, like the Seongno.
오른쪽은 The Palace Found of Silla. 아주 아름답죠.
That's the Shilla Palace,
경자한
the
앞집.
reconstruction of it.
그리고 신라의 왕관입니다. 이 현재 지구상에서 금관을 가장 많이 갖고 있는 나라는 바로 신라입니다.
This is a golden crown from Shilla. Shilla is hands down the most prolific producer of golden crowns.
이건 사실입니다.
It's a fact.
Yes. 그리고 이것은 바로 현재 카자흐스탄 알마티 근처에 있는 이식고분군인데 세계에게 알려진 스키타이 문화이고 이 금관과 이 금관이 유사하다는 주장들이 매우 많습니다.
So that crown that you see there on the right is from Kazakhstan, and there are a lot of people who draw connections.
다음 시간에 제가
between the two
금관을 다
crowns.
보여드립니다.
And on Friday, he's going to show you all the crowns.
가야는 좀 늦게 시작했고 이 나라의 특성은 이렇습니다. 왜 그러냐면은 시티 스테이트, 즉 그리스나 로마의 폴리스와 같은 조그만 도시국가 연합이 가야라고 저는 주장을 해왔습니다.
So there's another kingdom or federation known as Kaya, and he believes that these are maritime city-states or polis. These are really smallish city-states that came together as a federation, and that's his theory.
Sorry. 이런 식으로 되어 있습니다.
And those are the different colors represent the different city-states known as the six Kaya.
city state. And 초기에는 이렇게 주로 바닷가에 있었는데 여기 있는 세력들이 일본 열도로 가면서 다시 가야가 이 내륙에서 성장합니다.
So the Kaya cultural group, they actually began at the southern tip of the Korean peninsula, but they began to expand their territories and areas of influence into the Japanese islands, and more Kaya influence began to grow as a consequence deeper in the middle of the peninsula.
고고학적인 자료에 근거하면 이미 BC 4세기부터 가야에 있는 주민들이 일본 열도로 건너갑니다. 그러나 중국의 사료에 근거하면은 BC에서 AD를 전후한 시기에 한반도 남부에 있는 가야 세력들이 일본 열도로 건너갑니다.
So archaeological evidence points to movement of Kaya folk into the Japanese islands around the 4th century BCE, but textual material from Japan points to that happening sometime around the turn of the millennium.
지금도 일본 가는데 가장 가까운 곳은 부산입니다. 바로 부산 옆이죠.
The closest place to get to Japan from Korea is the city of Busan, which is where
가야의
was under the control of
고분들이
Kaya.
이렇게 많이 있는 지역입니다.
And it's an area where you find a lot of Kaya period.
이것은 부산 지역에 있는 고분에서 발견된 유물인데요. 이렇게 여기도 기마무사가 있었습니다.
And that's a cultural artifact that was unearthed near Busan, and you can see that it's the remains of the accoutrements of a warrior.
당연히 고구려 영향을 받은 것이죠.
And obviously, it was influenced heavily by Goguryeo culture
Okay.
up north.
많은 사람들이 한국의 역사를 모르고 있고요. 특히 일반적인 사람도 잘 모르지만 한국은 해양 활동이 매우 활발했습니다.
A lot of people don't understand Korean history, but what they really don't understand is that Korea was heavily engaged in maritime trade and interaction with other areas.
이 책은 한국 해양사입니다.
This is a book about maritime history in Korea.
이 책은 베트남어로 번역이 됐고
It's been translated into Vietnamese.
중국에서 번역하기 위해서 꽤 애를 썼지만 결국은 허락을 못 받았습니다.
They tried to translate it into Chinese, but they didn't get the permissions to do so.
네. 그래서 한국에서 결국은 중국어로 책을 냈습니다.
So it was published in Chinese, but in Korean.
저는 이 책을 영어로 그리고 일본어로 세계에 알리고 싶습니다.
He really wants this book to be translated into Japanese and English as well.
Yes. 그리고 고구려인들의 해양 활동로를 그린 것이고요.
This is a depiction of the maritime trade routes of Goguryeo.
백제 해양 활동로를 그린 것이고
And these are the maritime trade routes of Baekje.
이 시기에 중국은 북위는 바로 여기 있었던 선비족이 내려와서 세운 국가이고 여기 송제 양지는 이 지역에 있던 세력들이 도망가서 여기 세운 나라들입니다.
So the northern way was established by the Xianbei people from up north, and those who fled the incursion of the northern way, they established the countries down in the kingdoms out in the south, the Song, the southern Qi, the Liang, and the Jin.
신라인들도 이렇게 바다를 건너 일본 열도에 도착했습니다.
And the Shilla folk also traveled across the strait, the sea, to the Japanese islands through these maritime trade routes.
여러 지역에서 발견되는 고고학적인 유물과 그리고 일본의 역사 기록, 즉 일본의 고사기, 일본 서기의 건국 시단을 보면은 가야계도 있지만 신라계가 중요한 역할을 했다는 것을 알려주고 있습니다.
We use archaeological artifacts and also Japanese records like the Kojiki and the Nihon Shoki to reconstruct these trade routes.
번역. 그리고 가야 세력도 같고요.
And that's the path of influence of Kaya.
그렇구나. 제가 일본 고대사에 관한 책은 가져오지 않았지만 제가 일본 고대사에 관한 저서에서 이런 부분들을 상세히 설명했습니다.
And I explain all of this in my book on ancient Japan.
그래서 이제 중요한 사건인데요. 바로 이 시기에 동아시아에서는 거대한 국제 대전이 일어납니다.
This is a very important event. This is an international war that takes place during this period at the end of the 6th century.
이 전쟁이 중요한 이유는 우리 한민족도 중요하겠지만 당나라가 최종적으로 승리했기 때문에 현재 동아시아의 중국, 한국, 일본이라는 세 개의 체제가 이때 만들어집니다.
So the system of the three countries, China, Korea, and Japan, emerges in the wake of this international war, and this was really the consequence of Tang emerging victorious in this war.
이 전쟁은 70년간 벌어진 전쟁입니다.
And it's a war that lasted over 70 years.
전쟁의 목적은 The Great Game이죠. 헤게모니, economic power, and the collapse. culture collapse죠.
And those are the reasons behind the war.
이런 여러 가지 이유 때문에 당연히 이 전쟁에는 고구려와 함께 중국 세력이 싸움을 하지만 그러나 주변에 있는 모든 국가와 모든 나라들이 직접 간접으로 참여합니다.
So it's a war between China and Goguryeo, but in direct or indirect ways, everybody else, the surrounding states and polities were involved in this international war as well.
기본 구도가 이렇습니다.
And this is what that war basically looked like.
그리고 고구려 수나라 전쟁 때 이걸 그 당시 때 동원된 병력이 113만 3,800명입니다. 중국 측 기록입니다.
And that's how many soldiers were involved in the war between Sui, that is the predecessor to the Tang dynasty, and Goguryeo.
수나라는 졌고 수나라는 40년 만에 멸망했습니다.
So Sui dynasty loses that war with Goguryeo and collapses in 40 years.
중국에서 당나라가 당태종이 공격을 시작했고 10만여 명, 500척의 전선, 4만원 척 해군. 결국은 마지막 전투에서 당태종은 패합니다.
So Tang's Taizong invades with a troop of 100,000 with 500 ships and so on, but they actually lose that battle.
제가 말씀드린 분명한 역사적 사실에 근거해서 제가 말씀드린 겁니다.
And these are again all based on
그리고
facts.
세 번째 전쟁은 말 그대로 당나라, 신라가 연합하고 나머지 국가들이 연합해서 싸우는 3차 대전이 일어납니다.
So this is the third and last war. The first again was between Sui and Goguryeo. Second, Tang and Goguryeo, and the third is the alliance that was forged between Tang, China, and Shilla, which eventually results in the collapse of Goguryeo.
예, 백제 외 연합군이 패배하면서 백제 유민들이 일본 열도에 이렇게 많이 산성을 쌓았습니다. 이것은 바로 당시 일본 정부와 백제가 얼마나 특별한 관계에 있는가를 알려주는 증거입니다.
So Baekje is going to collapse as well. Those red dots that you saw in the Japanese islands, those were forts established by the Baekje immigrants, and you can see from this how the intimate relationship between the Baekje immigrants and the
이
Japanese.
전쟁의 결과 의미를 살펴보면은 중요한 것은 이때 일본국이 처음 성립된다는 겁니다.
And the significance of this event is that it's roughly around this time that we begin to see the rise of what we call today, Japan today.
일본국이란 명칭과 함께 통일국가로서 등장하게 되는 겁니다.
And the name Nihon-kuni, I suppose, in Japanese, it emerges during this period, and you can see the significance of these.
그리고 발해를 말씀드리겠습니다. 이제 5분 안에 끝냅니다.
I'll end in 5 minutes.
발해는 고구려를 계승한 나라입니다. 이런 증거들은 한국의 삼국유사는 주로 중국의 사료의 초기에는 발해가 고구려를 계승했다는 것을 분명히 얘기합니다.
So Balhae is a successor state to Goguryeo, and this is evinced in old Chinese histories, dynastic histories.
주로 일본 측의 기록에 따르면은 발해 국왕이 일본에 보낸 국서에 이렇게 고구려를 계승하고 영토를 차지했다고 기록되어 있습니다.
And in the Shokunihongi, a Japanese history, it states clearly that the Balhae king was attempting to recover Goguryeo old territory, hence the Appalachian successor state.
실제로 일본에서 발견되는 이런 목간이라든가 아니면 세라믹 이런 데 보게 되면은 이렇게 견고려사, 고려사. 그래서 당시 초기에 일본에서는 발해를 고려라고 불렀음을 알 수 있습니다.
And in wooden tablets and also ceramic dishes found in Japan, they refer to the envoys from Balhae as actually envoys or diplomats sent to or from Goguryeo. So you can see that Balhae and Goguryeo had a very a close relationship.
그리고 발해인들은 바로 이렇게 연호를 사용했습니다. 그러니까 연호를. 그래서 굉장히 독립적이었던 걸 알 수가 있습니다.
And from the fact that Balhae used its own era names shows you how independent they were.
조선은 연호를 쓸 수가 없었습니다.
Joseon, for example, could not use its own era name
중국의 영향권에 있었기 때문에.
because it was under the influence of Chinese culture.
그러나
and power.
고구려, 발해 등등은 전혀 다릅니다.
But Goguryeo and Balhae were different in this regard.
예. 그리고 본인들이 하늘의 자손이라는 증거들이 기록이나 도편을 통해서 많이 발견됩니다.
And there are a lot of records of them identifying themselves as the descendants from the God of heaven.
이것은 설에 근거한 발해 영토이고요. 특히 이렇게 프리모르스키 연해주 지역, 하바로브스키 지역은 러시아 학자들의 고고학적 발굴을 토대로 해서 그린 그림입니다.
So this reconstructions of the territories of Balhae are based on archaeological evidence, and the far eastern, northeastern territories, the archaeological evidence was done, of course, by.
이것은 제 분야의 전공이 아니기 때문에 더 정확한 거는 다른 전공자의 그림을 제가 빌려왔습니다.
This is not my field of expertise, so I've relied on the expertise of others. For
중국
that.
사람들이 그려놓은 발해의 궁의 모습입니다.
This is a depiction done by the Chinese of the palace of Balhae,
이건 정문
and that's the front gate of that palace.
마지막입니다.
And this is my last slide.
발해인들은 저는 아시아의 바이킹이라고 부릅니다.
He calls Balhae the Vikings of Asia.
220년 동안에 이 바다를 공식 엠베서더 사절단만 34번을 보냈습니다.
And in the 220 years, they sent more than 34 envoys.
1,100명의 민간인이 건너갔다가 쫓겨온 적도 있습니다.
And 1,100 immigrants had crossed the strait, but then they were forced to return.
저는 바다를 항해를 많이 했습니다.
I've traveled this
뗏목도
sea
탔고,
route myself
요트도 탔고.
many times.
And
On a yacht, on a raft.
저는 배를 타고 지금 북해까지 왕복한 사람입니다.
And I took a boat all the way up to the northern seas
90일간.
for 90 days.
그런데 동해 바다는 정말 어려운 바다입니다.
But that sea that you see there is a very difficult sea to navigate.
한겨울에 동해 바다는 건너기 힘듭니다.
Especially in the winter, it's very difficult to cross.
그런데 발해인들은 북서풍을 타야 되기 때문에 늘 동해를 건넜습니다.
But because the Balhae people had to cross the ocean, they had to rely on the northeasterly winds.
그래서 제가 아시아의 바이킹이라고 부릅니다.
And that's why I call them the Vikings of Asia.
여기에 일본 학자나 아니면 일본 학생들이 있을 수 있습니다.
There may be scholars of Japan and Japanese students here.
이 시기에 일본의 해양활동 능력이 뛰어났다고 그러는데 이런 모든 것들은 한국 사례에는 전혀 없습니다. 유감스럽게도. 그러나 주로 일본이나 중국 사례에 근거한 것입니다.
Japanese are very proud of their maritime history. A lot of this was reconstructed using Japanese sources on this subject.
이제 여러분들이 고대하던 시간이 왔습니다. 강의가 끝났습니다.
Finally, the time has arrived that you were all waiting for. This is the end of the lecture. Thank you all very much.
Thank you so much.
So why don't we give an opportunity to our speakers to ask questions of each other? So, Professor Westad, do you have any question for Professor Yoon?
Absolutely. I find the exposition fascinating in terms of looking at the various stages of the development of Korean history. And I know that your own expertise is connected with the earlier.
이게 단계적으로 역사를 보는 게 참 재밌다고 생각하고요. 이제 그러니까 교수님의 이제 그 expertise가 고대사라는 것도 잘 압니다.
So I had many questions. One question I had was about the composition of the original inhabitants of this larger Korean area that you outlined?
지금 가장 궁금한 것이 지금 이렇게 그린 한국의 좀 더 큰 영역의 한국 요식의 한국의 구성원들은 누구였는가에 대해서 좀 알고 싶다고 합니다.
So is there any recent genetic research that will show some of the connections between the original inhabitants in these areas and neighboring groups? Because it's always a big question in terms of how these people have traveled in terms of settlement,
Right.
but also sometimes with a little bit of luck, genetic research, DNA research can tell us something about how cultures travel between different groups.
혹시 유전학적인 그런 자료로 이렇게 그 북방에 살던 사람들과 한국에 토착 이제 인들의 이제
오케이.
교류에 대해서 알 수 있는 그런 자료가 있나?
답변할까요?
네.
네. 지금 교수님이 질문하신 내용은 5세기부터 7세기까지를 기준으로 할 때 그 시기에는 대체적으로 한국민의 원형이 완성됐다고 봅니다.
So scholars believe that the inhabitants of the Korean Peninsula, in terms of their genetic makeup and whatnot, had already been established pretty much by the somewhere between the 5th to the 7th century CE.
그런데 우리가 생각해야 될 것은 현재 중만주 이북의 북만주 지역에 있었던 퉁구스계 그리고 몽골어계는 특히 몽골어계는 당시 중국 사료의 기록을 보면은 우리 고대 국가인 부여와 즉 고구려와 통했다는 기록이 나와 있습니다.
So based on textual records, we know that there was connections between the Tungustic and the Mongoloid people up in the northern steppes with people who will come to inhabit the Korean Peninsula.
저는 그래서 중액 종족과 반개 종족이라는 구분을 하고 있습니다. 중액 종족은 지금까지 계속됐고 반개 종족들은 결국은 중국에 들어가서 정복 국가를 세웠다가 결국은 중국이란 거대한 질서에 편입이 됐다고 봅니다.
So he did. This is tough. So so he distinguishes between a core group and then a periphery group, and the periphery group will actually establish conquest dynasties in what are territories in China today.
Yes. 그리고 유전학적인 연구에 따르면은 한국 사람들은 주로 북방계가 많이 있다고 얘기를 하고 있고요. 남방계도 섞였다고 그러는데 제 관점은 역사적 공동체로서 유전학은 중요하지 않다고 봅니다.
So there is some DNA evidence to suggest that the vast majority came from the north. There is some DNA evidence to suggest that there was immigration from the south as well. But Professor Yoon himself does not really think that to understand the formation of the historical cultural community during this period, that DNA is very important.
왜냐하면 유전학자들이 시료를 채취하는 지역에 따라서 다릅니다.
And it really depends on where you collect the DNA evidence. So
Yes.
that's why he doesn't give it too much credence.
그리고 중국과 우리의 차이점은 우리는 북방 몽골로이드에 속합니다.
So the big difference between the Chinese today and Koreans is that the Koreans are connected or descendants of the northern Mongoloids.
중국의 핵심모는 중앙 몽골로이드, 그러나 광동성 이남은 남방 몽골로이드입니다.
So they're the northern Mongoloids and the southern Mongoloids.
그래서 우리는 북방 몽골로이드 중에서도 주로 알타이어를 사용하는 사람들이 많이 있습니다.
So Koreans are mainly descendants of the northern Mongoloids who belong to the Altai linguistic group.
그러나 최신의 연구에 따르면 알타이어서를 부정하는 견해도 있지만 그러나 그와 같은 언어를 사용하는 집단이 있는 것은 분명합니다.
There, more recent research has come to criticize or deny the Altai language group theory, but there's plenty of evidence to suggest otherwise.
그리고 우리 언어와 피와 문화 속에는 의외로 북방 초원 문화가 많이 남아 있습니다.
And he believes that in our culture, in our blood, and so on, there are still
language, culture.
right and language. There are still strong traces of the northern steppe culture and history.
I had just one more question, if I may. I was fascinated by this concept of the Eastern Asian Mediterranean.
Okay.
So this idea about how influence spread and how goods were exchanged in terms of this. And I'm, like you, fascinated by the sea. Not surprising, since I come from Norway.
노르웨이 출신의 자신도 바다에 대해서 관심이 많고
그렇죠.
이 동아시아 지중해라는 이 단념에 대해서 굉장히 관심이 많다고 합니다.
네.
So I was wondering, in terms of the kind of maritime vessels, the ships that we think were being used for these kinds of exchanges, were these different kinds of ships? Do we know anything about that at all? And was shipbuilding technology, because there must have been a lot of ships going in different directions, was that influenced across the various areas, or are there very different kinds of ships that contributed to this?
이 당시에 사용됐던 선박들은 어떤 것이었고 이 선박을 만드는 테크놀로지가 이 지역 전반적으로 나타나는지 아니면 다른 테크놀로지들이 있는지 그거에 대해서 혹시 아시는지
Do we know anything about that at all?
그거에 대해서 뭐 아는 게 뭐 있나?
그 동아시아 지역, 동아지중해 지역 쪽에서는 첫 번째 사람들의 교류가 활발했기 때문에 근대 이르기까지도 중국서 건너온 사람들이 많이 기록이 되어 있습니다. 또 한 가지는 문화를 볼 때도 유산 문화들이 예를 들면 고인돌, 특히 벼농사는 동아지중해를 통해서 우리 한반도에 전달이 됐습니다.
근데 그 구체적으로 선박 테크놀로지에 대한 증거나 그런 게 남아 있나?
선박 테크놀로지에 관해서
어떤 이제 선박을 사용했고 그 선박들을 어떻게 만들었고 그 만드는 그 테크놀로지가 여러 지역들이 다 비슷한 테크놀로지 썼는지 다른 테크놀로지 썼는지 그거에 대해서
제가 분명히 말씀드리는데 당시 동아시아 지역에서 해양 문화가 가장 뛰어난 나라는 중국 지역입니다. 그 중국 지역의 테크놀로지는 서양 세계의 그리스 세계보다 훨씬 뛰어납니다. 그리고 우리 한국은 기록이 남아있지 않습니다. 그리고 일본도 기록이 남아있지 않습니다.
So he's convinced that the shipbuilding and the maritime technology, China was at the top, but unfortunately we don't have records from Korea or Japan to say more about it.
다만 한국 문화 영향이 깊은 야요이 시대 때부터 고분 시대 때 일본의 고분의 암 그림이라든가 토기에 그려진 그림을 보면은 당시 조선설의 내용을 알 수 있습니다.
So there's some evidence that you can find from the Yayoi and the Kofun period in Japan, where you look at the murals and you can see images of ships, and we can use those to sort of guess what the ships actually look like.
또 하나는 서해 쪽의 배와 동해 쪽의 배는 다른데 동해 쪽의 배는 바이킹의 배와 거의 유사할 겁니다.
So Professor Yoon says that the ships used in the eastern and the western seas were very different, and the ones used in the eastern sea, the one that connected what is Russia today, Korea, and Japan, were probably much closer in design to the Viking ships.
본 모양도 서해와 달리 동해는 반드시 사각도시여야 합니다.
And the sails themselves have to be square.
근데 북서풍을 받아야 되고 파도가 높고 이걸 뚫고 나가야 되기 때문에 역시 북해랑 거기는 비슷합니다.
And he believes that this design had to be used because of the size of the waves and the need to rely on the northeast.
And also distance. I mean, the distance.
And the distance too. Yes.
그리고 중국 사료에는 그 당시 때 중국에서 만들었던 선박에 관한 설계도까지도 있습니다.
So Chinese sources, they tell you exactly how the ships were designed. So we have far more details about that from.
제가 중국 문화의 우수성을 부정하는 것은 절대 아닙니다.
And so he doesn't deny
Okay.
the sophistication of Chinese shipbuilding technology.
Okay, since we don't have much time, why don't we just jump into just sharing with you maybe 2 or 3 questions from the audience. The most kind of obvious and funny one.
오케이.
Why did you feel so ambitious to cross the waters between Korea and Japan? To understand the experience yourself?
뗏목을 타고 왜 이런 항해를 하셨는지 굳이 몸소 하셨는지 궁금하답니다.
저는 역사학은 행동학이라는 명제를 갖고 있습니다.
He believes that history is based on action.
실제 체험을 해야지 그때 살았던 사람들의 고통과 슬픔과 기쁨을 이해할 수 있습니다.
You can't understand their happiness, their sorrow, their pain, or anything unless you experience it for yourself.
직접 체험해야지 그 조그만 부분이라도 이해할 수 있습니다.
You have to experience it for yourself to just even get a glimpse of what the experiences back in the day were like.
저는 인간뿐만이 아니라 모든 존재물들에게 존재의 가치와 이유가 있다고 주장하는 사람입니다.
And he believes that there's a meaning of existence not only to human beings, to every single thing.
그것이 우리 고대 한민족의 사상입니다.
And he believes that that was the way of thought and the worldview of the ancient Korean people as well.
Okay, this question, I thought my handwriting was really bad, but wow, this kind of archaeological project.
이렇게 힘든가 봅니다. 글씨가 손글씨.
You mentioned several cultural connections between ancient Korean people and Altaic peoples. As far as I know, the Altaic hypothesis positing relationship between Japanese, Korean, and various inner Asian languages has been, finally I got languages, has been largely disproven by American and European linguists.
Okay.
이게 미국과 유럽 학자들에서 이 알타익 언어 문화권
Okay, I know.
이론이 이미 지금 비판을 많이 받았는데.
Okay, I know.
So what does the category Altaic mean to you? And does Korean language on culture fall under the category, or is it separate but related to it?
이 알타익이라는 카테고리에 대해서 어떻게 생각하시지? 그리고 한국은 이 알타익 카테고리에 어떤 관련성인지 부분인지 아니면 관련이 있는 어떤 연계가 되어 있는 그런 문화인지 그거에 대해서 궁금하다.
저는 역사학자입니다.
I'm a historian.
없어요. 그래서 언어학자라든가 입장이 다릅니다.
So my opinion is very different from that of a linguist.
한국 사람들은 대부분 모르지만 저는 알타이어설이 위협받고 있다는 것을 잘 알고 있습니다.
So he is well aware of the fact that the Altai language family theory is under attack and has been criticized.
그러나 알타이 문화권으로 유형화된 그런 문화권이 있는 것은 부정할 수는 없습니다.
But he doesn't think that you can deny that there was an Altaic linguistic cultural sphere.
그리고 한국 문화 속에서는 분명히 초원 유목 문화권의 영향이 강하게 남아 있습니다.
And there is strong evidence of influence of the northern steppes in the Korean peninsula.
다음 시간에 말씀드리겠지만 language, 언어, the customs and pace and crafts and 아주 많습니다. 이런 것들을 부정할 수는 없습니다.
So he'll talk about the traces of these influence of the northern steppes in more detail on Friday.
그래서 언어학자들이 알타이어설을 부정하지만 그러나 알타이어설로 유형화됐던 그 문화적 실체는 분명히 있기 때문에 저로서는 역사학자이기 때문에 현재로서는 그 연관성을 그 용어를 쓸 수밖에 없습니다.
So he understands that linguists now deny the Altaic cultural sphere and linguistic sphere theory, but as a historian he believes that such a sphere did exist and that it is very useful in understanding the cultural interactions between the northern steppes and the Korean peninsula.
지금 더 시간이 더 있습니까? 네, 알타이
좀 짧게
오케이.
네.
지금 알타이 지역은 알타이 마운틴 지역을 중심으로 한 것을 보지만 알타이 문화에 영향을 줄 것은 지금 서쪽 우크라이나 위쪽의 폰틱 초원. 폰틱 초원의 얌나야 문화부터 시작해서 그 다음에 아파나시오프 문화, 안도로노프 문화, 카라스크 문화로 해서 연결이 됩니다.
So most people place the center of the Altai cultural sphere in the Altai mountain range, but he believes that it should be placed further west above Uzbekistan and the grasslands there, and that it.
And Uzbekistan, no, Ukraine.
Ukraine.
is the Black Sea with.
Ukraine, very important.
Ukraine. I'm sorry.
So we have two remaining questions. The following question you can just answer yes or no. Okay?
Okay, I'm sorry.
Was the founder of Gojoseon, Proto-Joseon,
Yes.
ever honored in the same way that 기자 or 단군 were?
기자나
그 Korean people 질문한 사람이 한국 사람입니까?
No.
No. 오케이. 최초의 명칭은 조선입니다. 중국 사례에 나와 있습니다. BC 7세기경에 사례에 나와 있습니다. 고조선이란 말은 첫 번째 삼국유사 BC 13세기? 13세기에
BC가 아니라 C죠.
오케이, sorry. 13세기에 한국 기록에 고조선은 나와 있습니다. 그리고 일본인들이 한국 역사를 추상화시키기 위해서 그 용어를 확산시켰습니다. 올드 조선. 그러나 저는 한국에서 처음으로 출발했고 고구려를 비롯한 많은 나라들이 지금에 이르기까지 조선을 계승했기 때문에 프로토라는 관용어를 쓴 겁니다.
So didn't answer the question directly, but he says that the word Joseon appears in very early Chinese sources. It also appears in a 13th century Korean source. This is a very important source known as the Samguk-yusa. And there's clear evidence of the fact that successor states clearly looked to the Joseon as the state that they were succeeding, and so he believes that there is that connection there.
조선이라는 명칭 속에서는 학자들이 이렇게 분류를 했습니다. 단군 조선, 기자 조선, 위만 조선. 이것은 분류한 것이지 정식 국명은 아닙니다.
So scholars distinguish between 단군 조선 Kija Joseon and Wiman Joseon, but this is not this is something that scholars do, but not something that really exists.
이것은 매우 어려운 문제입니다.
It's a very difficult question.
yes, 그래서 기자조선 문제나 위만조선은 저로서도 답변하기가 매우 어렵습니다.
So he finds it very difficult himself to actually answer the question of Kija and Wiman Joseon.
다만 학자로서의 개인적 주장은 하고 있습니다.
But I do actually advance my own personal views as a historian.
저는 기자조선을 부정하고 위만조선은 우리 조선의 역사를 편입시킵니다. 이것은 학자적 주장입니다.
So as a scholar, he denies the theory of Kija Joseon, but he does accept Wiman Joseon as part of Korean history.
Okay, the time is up. I'm the person of keeping the promise. So those of you who wrote questions and haven't heard the answers, you can actually come forward and ask him in person. But thank you again, Professor Westad, for coming, and it's a wonderful talk. And thank you, Professor Yoon. This Friday at 12, we're going to have the second part of the talk with Korean food. Okay, so please come. Thank you so much, you guys. Thank you. Have a wonderful evening.